Operation Sindoor, India. In late April 2025, tensions flared in Kashmir after a deadly terror attack on tourists in Pahalgam killed 25 Indians and a Nepali citizen on April 22. India quickly blamed Pakistan-based militants for the attack. In response, Indian leaders vowed to punish the perpetrators. 2 weeks later, in the early hours of May 7, India carried out a major cross-border operation codenamed Operations. This involved pre-dawn air and missile strikes deep inside Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir, targeting 9 terror camps. The strikes represent one of the most significant exchanges of fire between the two nuclear-armed neighbors in decades. Background of rising tension. India and Pakistan have a long history of military skirmishes, often tied to militants based in one country attacking civilians in the other. In recent years, India has repeatedly vowed strong responses to such attacks. In particular, India cited previous exercises like the 2019 airstrike in Balaka and the 2016 surgical strike as precedents for cross-border retaliation. Analysts noted that Operation Sindoor followed a predictable pattern of calibrated Indian strikes after terror attacks. In the weeks before May 7th, diplomatic pressure had also mounted. India formally warned international partners that it had credible intelligence of terror plots emanating from Pakistan. Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri of India summarized Delhi's view. Pakistan is a safe haven for terrorists who face little punishment, and New Delhi believed further attacks on India were being planned. India repeatedly charged that Islamabad did not take any action against the militants after the Pahalgam incident. In a May 7th press conference, Misri declared that India was exercising its sovereign right to respond. He stressed that India's strikes were measured, known as escalatory, proportionate and responsible, focused on dismantling the terrorist infrastructure. By contrast, Pakistani leaders publicly warned India to stand down. Pakistan's Foreign Office accused India of a cowardly and treacherous attack. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif condemned the strikes as an act of war, said his nation was united behind the army, and vowed that Pakistan has the full right to respond, and it is responding with full force. Islamabad's top military spokesman, Lt-Gen Nadeem Anjum Chaudhry, stated that Pakistan's retaliation was already underway, both on the ground and in the air. Pakistan's official line echoed UN Article 51, declaring that it reserves the right to respond appropriately at a time and place of its choosing. The night of Operation Sindoor, May 7th, 1:05 a.m. under cover of darkness, India launched Operation Sindoor. India military briefings later revealed the attack lasted about 25 minutes, beginning at 1:05 a.m. local time. Targets and munitions in all 24 precision-guided missiles and rockets struck 9 different terror camps inside Pakistan and Pakistan-occupied. These sites were chosen from Army intelligence and were known bases of extremist groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Yash. For example, New Delhi named targets like Sawai Nala and Saidna Belal near the Gulpur and Abbas camps in Kutli district, and camps in Punjab such as Sarjal and Mut. Indian officials released maps showing the strike locations to emphasize that none were military bases, only terrorist training centers. Devastation in Pakistan-administered Kashmir after the strikes. Local reports said Indian missiles hit civilian areas, including mosques and homes. Scope of the attacks. India claimed all strikes were highly targeted to avoid civilian harm. The Indian Army said it struck only terrorist infrastructure and ensured no damage to military installations. According to India's press briefings, civilian casualty risk was minimized by careful planning. The locations were selected to avoid damage to civilian infrastructure and loss of any civilian life, said Air Force Officer Wing Commander Vyomika Singh. Pakistani account of the strikes. Pakistani media and officials described multiple blasts in Azad, Kashmir, and local residents in Muzaffarabad reported multiple loud explosions around midnight and a subsequent blackout. In Bahawalpur, Punjab residents heard 4 large explosions, and a seminary linked to Jem leader Masoodi Azhar was reportedly hit. In Kotli, a mosque was struck, killing a young boy and girl and wounding others. Reports also mentioned damage to electrical grids in urban areas. Pakistan's military confirmed strikes in 5 areas. Casualties. Indian sources stated the operation had destroyed the terror camp's capabilities. The Indian Army announced over 70 terrorists were killed and more than 60 wounded in the strikes. In a government briefing, officials said these were Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed operatives responsible for past attacks on Indians. Former Pahalgam victims' families celebrated what they called justice. Home Minister Amit Shah tweeted, "Operation Sindoor is Bharat's response to the brutal killing of our innocent brothers in Pahalgam," adding the government remained resolved to eradicate terrorism. Casualties. Pakistan's authorities reported far fewer militant deaths, but did confirm civilian casualties. Islamabad said at least 26 people were killed and 46 injured in Indian strikes. According to state media, those killed included civilians. In Kotli, 2 children died in a mosque in Bahawalpur. A child and siblings were among the dead. Pakistan's military later said 9 civilians were confirmed killed and 38 injured. Pakistani officials sharply contrasted this with India's claim of 0 civilian harm, accusing New Delhi of deliberately targeting civilian areas. Militaries clashed across the border. Almost immediately, artillery and air exchanges erupted. Pakistan's Air Force scrambled jets and claimed to have shot down an Indian jet in a drone. Though India denied any losses, both sides exchanged fire along the line of control in Kashmir. Indian military reports said Pakistani shelling on the low killed Indian civilians. For instance, the Indian Army reported that Pakistani forces' arbitrary and indiscriminate firing in Poonch the night before had killed 3 Indian civilians. In turn, Pakistan's DGI SPR-LT Jen Chaudhry declared that Indian planes had not been allowed to enter Pakistani airspace and warned that Pakistani jets would shoot down any violators. An official photograph shows a destroyed roof of a building in Muzaffarabad after the strike. Pakistani officials said at least 9 civilians died in the strikes, including worshippers at this mosque. Official reactions. India Prime Minister Narendra Modi cut short a foreign trip and held an emergency meeting after the strike. The Indian Ministry of Defense and Army repeatedly emphasized that the strikes were focused, measured, and honest in a Pentagon style. Press briefing. Air Force Wing Commander Singh explained the choice of targets. Operation Sindoor was launched to deliver justice to the Pahalgam victims. An all-sides hit had strong links to the April 22nd attack. Foreign Secretary Misri spoke at Ling. He called the Pahalgam killings the worst civilian massacre since 2008 and stressed that Pakistan had long sponsored cross-border terror. Misri reiterated India's right to take preemptive action and noted that intelligence had pointed to more plots. Home Minister Amit Shah loaded the armed forces on social media, calling the strikes a befitting response, and again vowing to eradicate terrorism. Government spokesman insisted no Pakistani military bases were touched and Indian casualty figures were negligible. Meanwhile, India's Press Information Bureau moved quickly to counter Pakistani social media claims. It warned citizens to beware of old images and confirmed no Indian aircraft was downed. Pakistani leaders uniformly condemned the strikes as illegitimate. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif publicly branded India's moves as a blatant act of war. In an evening address, he accused India of cowardly strikes on 5 locations inside Pakistan and threatened corresponding actions by the Pakistani military. The Foreign Office echoed the outrage, calling New Delhi's actions cowardly and vowing a response on the UN Charter, Article 51. Defense Minister Khawaja Asif and military spokesmen were more pointed, claiming the Pakistani Air Force had intercepted Indian jets and warning India not to cross airspace. The DGI-SPR urged Pakistani forces to take the fight to the low, declaring that Pakistan's retaliation is underway on the ground and in the air. Overnight, Pakistan reportedly reactivated air defense batteries and redeployed troops in the border. International world powers immediately appealed for restraint. The United Nations Secretary-General reportedly urged maximum military restraint from both sides. China, Pakistan's ally, publicly called on India and Pakistan to exercise restraint. The U.S. Embassy in Islamabad warned American citizens to avoid border regions in conflict zones after the strikes. Several countries, including Sweden and the United Kingdom, updated travel advisories and urged to calm eyewitness and journalist accounts. Independent observers reported a tense atmosphere on both sides of the line of control. In Muzaffarabad, international reporters and local journalists heard a series of heavy explosions after midnight. As one AFP photographer later noted, power went out across the city immediately after the blasts. Dawn newspaper correspondents described chaos in Punjab streets plunged into darkness after multiple blasts, with smoke rising from a targeted seminary. Residents filmed fires and rushing ambulances, especially near mosques, struck by the missiles. Eyewitnesses in Katli-Embag mentioned long lines of ambulances and injured civilians being treated in overcrowded clinics. In India, too, media reported exchanges of artillery fire on the Kashmir border. Army spokesman said Pakistani shelling had already killed civilians in border villages on the night of May 6, adding that Indian forces returned fire to protect communities. Local politicians from Kashmir spoke of shelling damaging homes and schools. Journalists noted that many flights in and out of Islamabad were cancelled on the morning of May 7, and schools in Pakistan's Punjab province were closed due to security concerns, humanitarian and geopolitical consequences. The immediate human toll remained in dispute. India tallied dozens of militant deaths, while Pakistan reported about 24 deaths. In addition, continued shelling on the Kashmir line of control took the lives of some Indian civilians, with the Indian Army confirming at least 3 dead and others injured on May 6. Hospitals in Muzaffarabad and Bahawalpur received the wounded from Wednesday's strikes, and Pakistan's chief secretary in AJK described the humanitarian response. Ambulances rushed victims to hospitals. Temporary shelters opened for evacuees near bombed sites, and relief agencies prepared for further displacement. Geopolitically, the strikes sent shockwaves through the region. It was the most intense India-Pakistan clash since the Kargil War, and in a nuclear era more dangerous than recent. Analysts warned of a risk of escalation. Pakistan's decision-making was closely watched for signs of and India's forces remained on high alert in case of reprisals. The Pakistani military briefly announced a military exercise at the border, but no major Indian territory incursions were reported beyond artillery duels and air patrolling. Internationally, concern was acute. China and the United States publicly urged dialogue and restraint, and UN officials appealed for de-escalation. The crisis prompted some countries to temporarily suspend diplomatic visits. For example, Sri Lanka postponed a planned summit with Pakistan. By May 7, the Indian government said it was still focused on security and reviewing its options, while also fielding a surge of diplomatic calls. The next few days would likely be critical in determining whether the conflict remains limited or spirals further. Expert analysis. Defense and geopolitical experts quickly weighed it. Many noted that operations appears to be a calibrated strike designed to achieve objectives without triggering full-scale war. For example, analysts at the Atlantic Council pointed out that India's strikes follow a predictable pattern established in previous. In each case, India pre-briefed international partners and then struck carefully chosen militant sites, underlining a strategy of deterrence rather than conquest. The Indian government itself underscored this message. Its official statement made clear the strikes were non-escalatory and a focused retaliation. One Atlantic Council expert concluded that a further immediate escalation or mobilization from India is unlikely, given the strike's precision and the fact that India had already signaled its intentions. Pakistan analysts argued differently, with some warning that any civilian casualties or accidents could inflame tensions. However, even many in Pakistan's security community appeared to downplay the chance of an all-out war. As one retired officer remarked to local media, both sides knew the stakes of nuclear confrontation were too high. International commentators also highlighted secondary effects. Kashmiris on both sides reported anxiety over renewed cross-border fire, and aid groups noted that disrupted livelihoods were an immediate concern. In the days following Operation Sindoor, the focus of experts shifted to containment. Some Indian strategists suggested that future operations might go further if Pakistan's retaliation was strong. Pakistani commentators warned that Islamabad would have to show resolve. Meanwhile, analysts outside the region urged both governments to negotiate through back channels to avoid miscalculation. On May 7th evening, most experts agreed that Islamabad would likely respond rhetorically or with limited strikes across the lope, but a major conventional assault seemed unlikely unless either side's leadership chose to escalate dramatically. Summary Operation Sindoor marks the latest and most serious flare-up in the long-standing India-Pakistan conflict. It was explicitly framed by India as a strike against terrorist launch pads, just as 4 victims of the Pahalgam massacre. Pakistan's immediate reaction was outrage and vows of retaliation. Civilians in Kashmir, Punjab, and elsewhere bore the brunt of the hostilities, underscoring the humanitarian cost of such tit-for-tat action. Internationally, concern about a wider war prompted diplomatic interventions, and global media scrutinized the action. In a formal post-strike briefing, India's Foreign Secretary noted that 3 Indians have died due to cross-border terrorism in the past decade and signaled that India's patience had limits. Pakistan's leaders, for their part, insisted they would respond in kind. As the dust settles, questions remain: will this operation deter future attacks or simply heighten the cycle of retaliation? Will wider war be averted through international pressure? And most critically, can the two rivals return to dialogue and restore a fragile peace?